and say hello. Welcome to our Facebook Live audience, as well as our Zoom audience. My name is John Schumann. I am a board member of the Tulsa Literary Coalition, and delighted tonight to welcome Dr. Suzanne Koven, who is author of Letter to a Young Female Physician, which you can sort of see on my blurry screen. And we're gonna start by talking to her and take your questions. There is a much better version of the book from Dr. Koven. And I want to just take a minute to tell you about some upcoming events at Magic City. Jeff Martin has the night off. He's asked me to pinch hit for him here. So tonight you're here because you want to hear from Dr. Koven. On May 14th, which is tomorrow, we have author Daniel James Brown about his new book, Facing the Mountain, which I see has been getting some good press. On May 17th, there's another free Zoom event. These are all virtual events. Ian Manuel, who was incarcerated as a teenager and sentenced to life in prison, but fortunately did get out and has written a memoir about it and is now an inspirational speaker. Will be talking about his book, My Time Has Come. And one more event to talk about on two more. May 18th, there will be a virtual event with Scott Ellsworth, who will do a book launch for his book called The Groundbreaking, an American City. And it's called The Groundbreaking, an American City and its Search for Justice, all about Tulsa. And as you know, we're coming up on the centennial of the Tulsa Race Massacre in 1921. And so that book is highly anticipated. That is actually a ticketed event. So you have to buy a ticket, but that gets you a copy of the book and entrance to the Zoom. And then on May 23rd, we have Don Lemon, CNN anchor, who has his new memoir out, This Is the Fire, talking about his work and his career at CNN and his role in being somewhat of a foil to former President Donald Trump. That also is a ticketed event, but if you go to Magic City Books, our website, you can buy tickets online. You can see all the upcoming events at the link that Matt just put in the chat. We encourage you to enter questions in the chat. We'll be keeping an eye on those if you have questions for Dr. Koven. But I am very pleased tonight to welcome someone who is inspiring to me very much personally. I've had the pleasure to talk to her and interview her a couple of other times, but someone whose career I would very much like to emulate, and it is Dr. Suzanne Koven. She is a primary care physician, something that I also do in my spare time, and she is on the faculty at Massachusetts General Hospital and at Harvard Medical School. She is also the inaugural writer in residence at Massachusetts General Hospital, and we'll probably talk a little bit about what that means. And this is her first book, Letter to a Young Female Physician. And I thought we would start by having Dr. Koven read from her letter, which opens the book, her letter to a young female physician, and then we'll get into some discussion from there. So Suzanne, please take it away.
Sure, I'm going to read from the end of the letter. Early on, I believed that displaying medical knowledge, the more obscure the better, would make me worthy. That belief was a useful spur to learning, but ultimately provided only superficial comfort. During my first year clinical skills course, an oncologist asked me to identify a rash. Mycosis fungoides, I blurted out, since it was one of the few rashes whose name I knew and the only one associated with cancer. My answer turned out to be correct, causing 3 jaws to drop at once, the oncologist's, the patient's, and my own. But the glow of validation lasted barely the day. A little further on in training, I thought that competence meant knowing how to do things. I eagerly performed lumbar punctures and inserted central lines and applied for specialty training in gastroenterology, a field in which I had little interest, thinking I could endoscope my way to self-confidence. My first few years in practice, I was sure that being a good doctor meant curing people. I felt buoyed by every cleared chest x-ray, every normalized blood pressure. Unfortunately, the converse was also true. I took cancer recurrences personally. When the emergency room paged to alert me that one of my patients had arrived there, I assumed that some error on my part precipitated the crisis. Now, late in my clinical career, I understand I've been neither so weak nor so powerful. Sometimes, even after I studied my hardest and tried my best, people got sick and died anyway. How I wish I could spare you years of self flagellation and transport you directly to the state of humility. I now understand that I should have spent less time worrying about being a fraud and more time appreciating about myself some of the things my patients appreciate most about me: my large inventory of jokes, my knack for knowing when to butt in and when to shut up, my hugs. Every clinician has her or his own personal armamentarium, as therapeutic as any drug. My dear young colleague, you are not a fraud. You are a flawed and unique human being with excellent training and an admirable sense of purpose. Your training and sense of purpose will serve you well. Your humanity will serve your patients even better.
Thank you for reading. That, as you said, was the closing part of the letter to a young female physician. And Suzanne, was that letter, it is to a young female physician, unnamed, and it was to your younger self as well as to generations that are now coming after you?
Yes, absolutely. It was to my younger self. It started with an exercise I was enlisted to help facilitate, where young interns starting their internship in June of 2016, which was exactly 30 years, almost to the day when I started my own internship. They were asked to write a letter to their future selves, the future being 6 months down the road when they would be handed back the letter and they could see how far they've come. And as I watched them do this, I felt inspired to write a letter to myself 30 years earlier. And I didn't really know what I would say until I sat down to write it. That letter became an essay that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. And that essay then became this book.
So one of the themes that you touched on there and that appears in the earlier part of the letter is you mentioned the word fraud, or as what you refer to as imposter syndrome. Tell us a little bit about that and why you suffered from that perhaps early on in your career.
Yeah, it wasn't only early on, it lasted a really long time. So, imposter syndrome is a term that, though it was coined by psychologists back in 1978 when I was in college, not long before I started medical school, I had never heard it back then, though I clearly suffered from it. And what it is a sort of private conviction that anything you achieve is purely luck. And, that school you got into, it was a fluke. That promotion you got, you didn't really deserve it. It's only going to be a matter of time before you get found out. When it was first described, it was it was described as something that occurred in high achieving women. It turns out that it's really just as common in men. And what I learned when I published that essay in the New England Journal, and it got a kind of an amazing response, in terms of numbers of people accessing it and writing to me, is that it's incredibly common, not just among young people, not just among women, not just among physicians. And a lot of people who wrote to me pointed out that really what's going on for a lot of people in imposter syndrome is a kind of internalized sexism, sometimes internalized racism, where it's this sort of drip, drip, drip effect of being told your whole life in various ways that you're not quite up to snuff. You believe it. And so you keep trying to be perfect and you keep trying to achieve, except every brass ring you manage to grab, it doesn't make it better. It only makes it worse, in fact, because the higher you climb, the more unworthy you feel. For me personally, it took me a long time to get over that. When I was a chief resident at Johns Hopkins Hospital. I mean, this was, pretty great honor and pretty heady stuff. And I think I did a very good job at it, but I spent the entire year thinking, boy, it's only a matter of time before they figure out they made a terrible mistake. And, what ended up uh, curing me of this very common, I think, problem is is not having achieved stuff, but just living life and doing the kinds of things in which you realize that success doesn't mean perfection. Parenthood, marriage, doctoring, writing. You can't be perfect in any of those things, and yet you can be successful. And I think that once you sort of start dismantling that belief that if I'm not perfect, it means I'm a fraud, um, you start kind of getting over it. The other thing that helps to get over it is to talk to other people about it and realize that everybody feels the same way, or most people do. And we can't all be frauds. That just statistically wouldn't make sense. So it took a long time. And one of the things I hoped to achieve in that essay, and I hope to achieve in this book, is to, as I say in the essay, spare some of my younger colleagues years of self-flagellation, which is unproductive and undeserved.
What kind of response do you get from, say, the interns at Mass General, or the residents or fellows that you work with, or young attendings, or really colleagues in general? What kind of response do you get when they meet you and they say, "Oh, I read your letter," or "Now I've read your book"? And I mean, do they identify with it, or do they say, "Hey, you actually have saved me some time and some worry by making this clear-cut message"? I mean, have you found it to
Yeah.
have that kind of impact you hope for?
I think maybe, yes. The book's only been out about 8 days,
Yeah.
so, not too many, people have read it yet, but I certainly got that kind of feedback from, the essay, and starting to get it from the book. Um, uh, it's been really well, on the one hand, it's been really gratifying, particularly to hear younger people say, "Thank you for articulating this thing that I feel, because I thought I was the only one who really felt this way." I mean, that's a gratifying thing for a writer. What's a little bit disappointing or even alarming is that women who are young physicians now, or young professionals, or just young, um, don't seem to be suffering from it any less than women of my generation. We don't seem to be making a whole lot of progress with this. And one of the things I say in the book is that of all the feedback I got on that original essay, the only a bit of negative feedback I got was from an 80-year-old feminist scholar who, when I showed her the essay, originally, she said, "Imposter syndrome. I thought we got over that years ago." Well, we didn't.
Wow. Um, I also wonder too, something that I've wondered for a while. You talk even at the get-go in the letter about the sense how you took it personally or as a failing if a patient wound up in the emergency department, or developed cancer or something, as somehow you had missed something. And it's a sense of, I think, perfectionism that we have as we're trainees and as we are young doctors. And I wonder, do you feel like the sort of current generation that you're working among at MGH or Harvard Medical School, is that perfectionism still there? That hasn't gone away, has it? Even though I think we often hear that, I think, physicians of a certain age or generation, there's sort of a perennial criticism of the younger generations. Oh, they're not as hardworking as we are, or they're not as don't take it as seriously as we do. I don't know. What's your experience with that?
Well, oh, I think it's even worse now, actually. Let me back up and say that that sense of responsibility of, if something goes wrong with a patient, it's my fault. Um, you know, uh, in order to be an effective, doctor or nurse, you need to have some of that um, sense of responsibility. I mean, it's not entirely an unhealthy or unhelpful thing to feel that sense of personal responsibility. Um, uh, where it goes haywire is when, in a way, it's a kind of a grandiosity, isn't it? That, well, if somebody comes to the emergency room, it must have been something I did, as if, people don't get sick. I mean, people do get sick, and sometimes, it's not our fault. In terms of the younger generation of doctors now, um, I don't see that. Whoops. I don't see them as any less perfectionistic, as any less embracing of a sense of personal responsibility. I think they're um, I think they're nicer than we were. Well, you're younger than I am, but they're nicer than residents were when I was a resident. They're more respectful of patients. I think they lead somewhat more balanced lives, partially because the amount of hours that they have to work are a little bit less ridiculous. But I wondered, particularly when I first, drafted this book and started showing it to young physicians, whether they would say, gosh, it must have been really bad back then, but I don't think I really know what you're talking about." They didn't say that. They said, "Yes, this is how I feel, and this is what it's like now." And in some ways, and certainly now with the pandemic, because of social media, because people are physically isolated from one another, it's easier to project this idea that other people have it all together and you don't. I mean, this is a commonplace. This isn't an insight that's original with me, but if you're looking at somebody else's Instagram feed and you're looking at their homemade cookies and their Hawaiian vacation, it's it's easy to feel like your life is pretty is pretty dull. We didn't, that's one thing we never had to contend with. We were in the hospital all the time in our white pants and our white coats, and nobody was going to Hawaii or baking cookies. So that's one aspect we didn't have to deal with.
Yeah,
I think there's a question already. Isn't that cool?
oh, that is good. Well, yeah,
You keep going. You do your thing.
no, I'll definitely work it in.
Yeah.
So I see the question. I wanted to just ask a little bit about something you write about in the book. So the book is a memoir, and it's a lot about physicianhood, physicianship, and being a female physician. But it's so personal, the book, and it's beautifully rendered, and it's a story of your family and your parents and your father who was a physician and your mother who later in life went back to law school and became a lawyer, which, kind of incredible. Just incredible, I think, for the times, that this was, many years ago.
Yeah.
And in addition, that your father, I think, was so, tolerant of it, or so, he could have had a wholly different attitude about it. And I want to talk a little bit about that, but I actually am curious too, because one of the chapters you write, or a couple of chapters, are about your pursuit of a master's degree in arts. And you did it in an interesting way. So here you are, you're married, you have children, and you're already a physician in practice, and you decide to pursue, an MFA degree, right? Or is it a mass? Okay. And tell us about how you went about it and sort of the pathway, because it's quite interesting. And it was like it was like a different world for you. And that's something that I would point out to our audience. It's very unusual for physicians to pursue. Some doctors many get masters in public health. Some will get MBAs, things like that. I mean, many will get PhDs because they're scientists as well as doctors. But an MFA is really quite special.
Yeah, it's special. It's not unheard of, and there were other MDs in my MFA program. What happened was, starting in my 40s, something happened to me, which I think happens to a lot of people in their 40s, which it began to dawn on me that I wasn't going to live forever. And I know, spoiler alert, what can I tell you? I had been an English major in college. I loved reading and writing. And that had all gone by the wayside during the years when I was in medical training, growing a medical practice, raising a family. And, I got into my 40s and I thought, I really love that. I miss that. How can I get more of that or some of that? And I started sneaking over to Harvard Square after work with my backpack and, trying to masquerade as a graduate student. And I took one course per semester for 8 years. And not just writing, but, literature, Greek tragedy. I was writing English papers. That was my hobby. And I did that for 8 years, and I got a degree a master's degree in literature. And then when I was in my early 50s, I decided, I really want to be a professional writer, but I don't seem to be getting anywhere with it. I come home from work. I've got 3 kids. I'm exhausted. It just doesn't seem to be happening for me. And my husband kept saying to me, you got to do what you know how to do, which is go to school. I'm an A student. You give me an assignment, I'll do it no matter how tired I am. And he was right. So I did what's called a low residency MFA program. I'm sure many people here are familiar with that, where 10 days twice a year for 2 years. I went to Bennington and lived in a dorm. And in the in-between time was working with a teacher on manuscripts, and that really um, started to get things going. And then I was submitting things, and I started writing a newspaper column and so forth. The truth of the matter is, it's very hard. What I'm about to say sounds a little silly, but it's true. It's really hard to become a writer if you don't do a lot of writing. And it's really hard to do a lot of writing just on your own. Or at least it was for me. For some people, they get up before work at 4 in the morning and they just write. I couldn't do that. I needed feedback. I needed deadlines. And that's what I got in my MFA program. And, it's said that you can't really teach somebody to write, but you can teach somebody to read their own writing. And that's what I really learned there. I learned how to edit myself. And and so that's how it happened. Now, as I say, it started off like as if I was kind of being sneaky or certainly doing something that had nothing to do with my medical career. But over the years, my writing and my love of literature has gotten closer and closer and closer to the hospital, to the point where now, as writer in residence, I actually spend more time in that role, uh, coaching writers, mentoring writers who are healthcare workers, running writing groups and reading groups, than I do seeing patients, though I still do see patients.
Well, two questions stemming from that. So the first one, you mentioned how seemingly atypical it was for a physician, although there were physicians in your cohort. But in the environment in which you work, were people encouraging you when they heard you were doing this, or did you keep it on the down low that you were sort of sneaking off to do this writing as a quasi graduate student, and it was just something you did as a passion and as a hobby? Did people say, "Oh, you're wasting your time," or "You need to be more committed to science," or that kind of thing? Or what was the response, I wonder?
Well, no, nobody who knows me would have told me to become more committed to science, because that wasn't happening. Um, but because that's just not who I am. I didn't really tell anybody about it, in the same way that, like if you all of a sudden got really into wine or tennis, or whatever, decided to take French lessons, you might, you might bring it up at a party or something, but you weren't talking about it a lot at work. It wasn't a secret, but it didn't strike me as being particularly relevant. Um, but as I say, over the years, it got closer and closer and closer, until right now, my medical career and my writing career aren't different. They're one and the same.
Okay, so tell our audience, what does it mean when you're a writer, the writer in residence at Massachusetts General Hospital? First of all, I would say most of the hospitals I've worked at don't have a writer in residence, so
Yes,
that
that's true.
sounds
Yeah.
pretty fantastic as we're. So what kinds of things does that involve, and
Well,
how is it, how is it structured?
It's the coolest gig ever. I mean, I completely made it up. Um, uh, so so the short version of the story is that several years ago, I started running a monthly reading group at the hospital. People would sign up and we'd meet around a conference table under the fluorescent lights in a room next to the cafeteria. And I would choose, you know, a book or a play, and we'd read Shakespeare and we'd read Kafka and we'd read William Carlos Williams or whatever. And it got to be very popular. People really enjoyed it. And so my division chief in internal medicine said, yeah, people seem to really like this. Maybe you could figure out a way to bring it to more people. And that evolved into this larger role, which then went hospital wide. So what I do in that role, in addition to running reading groups, writing workshops, for which there's enormous demand, it's really very interesting. Healthcare workers, especially during the pandemic, are really hungry for discussion, really hungry for feedback on their writing. Perhaps that's not so surprising that during a crisis, people want to talk, they want to express themselves. I also run literary events. We have an annual celebration of National Poetry Month, as we just did in April. And I do a lot of, as I said, coaching and mentoring of individual writers. People send me manuscripts all the time.
Is that gotten cumbersome? Because I know from people who are writers or journalists or even Hollywood agents, I'm sort of distantly related to one, and everyone always says, hey, I want you to read my screenplay. And he kind of always rolls his eyes. Do you get to the point where so many people inundate you with manuscripts that you can't possibly look at them all? Or do you feel an obligation, if they're at Mass General, to do so?
Well, it's my job. So, it's like saying, does it feel cumbersome, to me that I see patients? I mean, this is my job. And it's a great joy to me. Um, Particularly joyful to me is dealing with someone who has spent their whole career doing something else, maybe doing some academic writing, and yet they have this repository of stories that they want to find a way to tell. And they may not have read a whole lot of literature. They may not know the rudiments of narrative writing, and to sort of help them begin to open up that form of expression is really a lot of fun. You also have to remember, I mean, I spent decades doing something else. It's not, I haven't been doing this for all that long, so it's not like I'm some grizzled old editor who's sick of, reading manuscripts. I mean, this is, this is my joy, my playground.
That's great. Well, um, we have yeah, let's ask you this question. So someone has asked, how do you mentor differently than your mentors guided you? And I assume that's asking about your medical mentors, but perhaps writing mentors too.
That's a great question. So, because I've been thinking actually a lot about what a mentor is. We talk a lot about mentors, but this came up actually in our monthly reading group, because we were reading Sigrid Nunez National Book Award winning novel, The Friend. And if you haven't looked at that, it's just quite wonderful. It's a very small book. And, and what it's about, the basic plot is a middle-aged woman who's a writer. Her mentor, her writing mentor, dies. This is not I'm not spoiling anything. You find out very quickly. And he bequeaths her a gift, and the gift is a Great Dane. And she lives in a small apartment in New York that doesn't permit dogs. So it sort of opens up this discussion of, is mentorship a gift, or is it a burden, like having a Great Dane in an apartment in New York? And what exactly is a mentor? Is it the same thing as a teacher, as a guide, as a friend, as a patron, and so forth? I think, to answer your question specifically, Jill, um, I think when I was younger, the kind of mentorship I got was was like getting advice. Like, you should really do this, and you should really apply for that. It was very prescriptive, and it was usually, I should say, by men, because of course, most of the people who were in positions of authority when I was young were men. And guess what? Most of them still are. So, what I do that I think is a little different is, somebody comes to me for, say, writing mentorship or career mentorship, and they're like, they don't want to waste my time, and they want to be really efficient and get the question out, and should they apply for this or should they do that, and which specialty should they choose and which residency should they go to. And I always begin by asking them, just to kind of tell me their whole life story, and which is more or less my approach to patients, maybe a little bit more abbreviated form. And I just sort of get a sense of who they are. And as we get to know each other, what I try to do, don't always succeed, but what I try to do is what I think good mentors do, which is they have more imagination about your possibilities than you do. And I got this insight a few years ago when I went to talk to somebody who I'd been told would be like the perfect mentor for me. And I left that meeting feeling incredibly discouraged. And a friend of mine said, you know, if you leave a meeting with a mentor feeling that your possibilities are narrower than before you talk to them, that's not the right mentor. You should leave a meeting with a mentor feeling like, wow, I just, I could do anything. I could, like, I never even thought of doing that. So, as I said, I think I used to think mentorship was very prescriptive. That's the kind of mentorship I received, for the most part, not entirely. And I hope the kind of mentorship I'm providing is, you know, look at you, look at where you've been, look at where you could go, look at your choices, and I want the person who gets mentorship from me to leave the room feeling, wow, I could do anything, not, ugh, you know, I guess that's not going to work out.
Well, continuing this thread, Emily has asked if you have advice for young physicians who are mothers. How do you balance your family and your work? Fair
Mm.
question.
Yeah, Emily, that is a great question. If you read my book, you'll see that my own uh, my own mixing of motherhood and medicine did not have a particularly auspicious start. I got pregnant as an intern, didn't adjust my work hours, and ended up with preeclampsia. So that wasn't so great. Um, I have three kids. They're grown now. I'm a grandma, and uh, honestly, when my kids were little and I went into practice, I made the decision to work part-time. And I was very fortunate to be able to do that. Not everybody can do that. Um, my husband's also a physician. And it just became very clear to me, to us, that, we both couldn't work full time. And so I think um, I wish we had evolved to a place where men and women were making that choice equally. We have not evolved to that place. Women are much more likely to make that choice than men are, and no matter who's working full time or part time, women are spending on average um, about 8.5 hours or a full day a week extra on childcare and housework than male partners. So we're not making a whole lot of progress there. What I would say, for us as individuals is to realize that, you know, if we're lucky, life is long. You don't have to do everything all at once. If you need to step back and not lean in for a few years, it really is okay. I think particularly in medicine, there will be ways to re-enter and ramp up later. And just not to be so hard on yourself. um, uh, I was certainly very hard on myself, and I think most women in that position are.
Suzanne, I want to talk a little about the book. You have an essay or a chapter on the hateful patient, which is something that, um, I think in any medical career, we all confront, or as we are confronted by. And you cite sort of the original sort of New England Journal article about the hateful patient, I think from 1976, which I read back when, I had that experience, and a mentor or a faculty member said, "Hey, you should read this article." Tell us about that, the incident that you reflected on in writing that chapter. And I guess for our audience who are non-medical, it sort of sounds hateful patient. How could anyone be hateful to, a doctor when you're trying to help them, that kind of thing.
Oh, that's not what I thought you were going to say. I thought you were going to say for somebody not in medicine, you would say, how could a doctor who's supposed to be kind and helpful hate anybody?
That too.
That doesn't sound too good. Well, look, I mean, as with any other kind of, human being, we all have people whose behavior makes us uncomfortable or anxious, and who, we would rather, not see. I mean, there are articles about this every year at the holiday time, what to do when you have to face Aunt so and so at, Thanksgiving. And she always says that, horribly insulting, triggering thing for you. Well, um, there are patients like that who tend to make doctors feel very defensive, very inadequate, sometimes very offended. And when we see their names on our schedule, we think, oh boy, this is going to be an awful day. So I had such a patient years ago, and I had a funny kind of relationship with her because on the one hand, she was a real pain. She was kind of mean and not very nice. And, uh, I would spend an hour with her and then she would accuse me of not spending enough time with her. And um, uh, she just was tough. And yet I also kind of really liked her and admired her. And she was just her toughness, which made me, uncomfortable and made me feel she was a pain, was also a really admirable trait. She was somebody who had suffered a lot and had survived a lot. Anyway, nothing I did made her happy, nothing. And one day I finally said to her, "Is there anything I could do that would make you happy?" And her response shocked me. What she said was, "Yes, tell me that you love me." And I've been practicing medicine now for over 30 years. That is one of the most memorable moments of my career. And as I say in the book, I didn't know what to say because I didn't want to be dishonest. I didn't love her. I wasn't even sure I liked her. And I really had to kind of come to terms with what my role was. It was really important for me to help her, and if she needed for me to tell her that I loved her to help her, would it be okay to say that even if it were not entirely honest? And you'll have to read the book to find out what I decided to do.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to shift back and just talk a little bit, because you write so evocatively about both of your parents, and sort of about even your childhood, your lives growing up in Brooklyn, and their careers and how they impacted you. And I guess, I mean, on the radio, I asked you to start with your father because he was the doctor. But tell us about sort of his practice and how he encouraged you or otherwise with your career in medicine.
Mm. Well, as I told you in the radio piece, and by the way, I thought that was really cool on the radio that you gave me a lot of time and space to sort of expand on these stories. I'll make it a little more brief here. Yeah, my father was a fascinating character. He was an orthopedic surgeon who never spoke about his work ever. As I've said, the only evidence I had that he was a doctor was that he always had plaster spattered on his shoes from making casts. And the other piece of evidence I had was that in our house, the phone ringing in the middle of the night was no cause for alarm because there were no such things as pagers in those days, or cell phones, certainly. So there was an answering service, and it would just call in the middle of the night that, Dr. Koven was needed. He never talked about it. He was very cerebral. He was a painter. He was a self-taught scholar of the novels of James Joyce. And he did not encourage me. I was the only girl. I have two brothers. He did not encourage any of us to go into medicine. And in fact, he just never spoke about medicine. And yet, as I describe in the book, as a way to try to get to know him better, because he was so mysterious to me, I tagged along with him on hospital rounds from a very young age, and also to his office well into my teens. My mother, if that's your next question, she was a different character altogether. He was quiet, shy, heavy, slow moving, cerebral. She was 10 years younger, slender, charming. She looked like Jackie Kennedy when she was young, and social, very bright, a really bored housewife in the 60s, and a classic overeducated housewife of the 60s. And she did a pretty bold thing, talk about mentors, imagining something for you that you don't imagine for yourself. She wasn't mentored in this, she mentored herself. But when she was 44 in 1971, she started law school. At the same time that I started high school. I was the youngest child. She waited for me to start high school. And so both of my parents um, were very influential on me, but in different ways. I'm temperamentally a lot more like my mother. I look exactly like her. In fact, if I watch a video of myself, such as this one, I'll remark to myself, it's kind of amazing they got my mother to be on video when she's been dead now for so many years. I mean, I look and sound exactly like her. But I chose to be a doctor who writes, which was really more kind of up my father's alley.
Well, so, one of the things I think this book does so incredibly well, and like I think many physicians, probably all physicians, struggle with morbidity, infirmity, illness in our own families because we're looked upon to be the ones to kind of solve the problem, fix the illness, cure the disease. And as your life lesson has taught, that's just not always possible. People get sick. And I guess your reflections upon their aging, your parents aging, and you being the medical one of your siblings, it has a profound impact. So I guess for our viewers, what without taking too much out of the book, encouraging folks to read it, what are some of the deepest memories of both when your father got ill and then your mother?
Yeah, well, I think my being a doctor in some ways was just sort of an exaggeration of what many people face in middle age, which is that you have this sad role reversal where you're now taking care of the people who, for so many years, took care of you. When you're a doctor, there's an added layer, which is, if they sicken and ultimately die, which they do, you screwed up. It's not fair. It's not rational, but you screwed up. You didn't prevent that from happening. In my case, there was sort of this additional element with my mother, which I go into in some detail, which is that I missed the diagnosis of the disease that killed her. Now, to be fair, her actual doctors also missed that diagnosis. But most of my patients are women. I'm a veteran practitioner of women's health. And my mother rolled into my own emergency room with a diagnosis that had evolved under my nose for several months and which I had missed entirely. So that those layers of guilt were greatly compounded. Now, my mother didn't see it that way at all. She didn't think it was my responsibility to diagnose and treat her. Um, she thought I was perfect, which only made me feel worse, of course. Um, but yeah, I think that is just a fundamental kind of fact of life, which I talk about in the book, which is that, um, if you're a parent and your child suffers, you feel like you screwed up. If you're a child and your parent suffers, you feel like you screwed up. And I think it's just a very kind of primitive biological feeling. It's not, as I say, it's not fair, it's not rational. Things happen out of our control, but there's tremendous guilt and shame associated with the suffering of people that we love.
We have another question from the audience, but I'm gonna just ask you something beforehand because I think it'll lead well into that, which is it's hard not to ask everybody and anybody, but especially people who work in healthcare about COVID-19. And you have share with us how it impacted you and your family, and then kind of what you did about it. And then that leads into a sort of another, you did a radio essay for Marketplace, which I'll put in the link here. People can listen to. Yeah. It's just 2 or 3 minutes. It's really beautiful.
Yeah, thank you. So I think for our family, it was, pretty much the same as for most people's families. We hunkered down. We worked from home. I thought that what was going to happen to me was that, I'm one of the older members of my practice, and that I would be seeing patients virtually, and suiting up in PPE and going to the hospital was a younger woman's game, was not going to be what was going to be my role. And then, as I say in this radio piece, which is only 2 minutes long, and also say in an essay in the book, is that I'm at this age where when emails come around, there's this new opportunity, there's this new initiative, there's this new training. I delete them because I don't do new, I do old. I mean, I don't need to do anything new. Well, she says, she who went to graduate school in her 50s, but you know what I'm saying. Anyway, so if, in mid-March, an email came around that asked for primary care doctors who were interested in volunteering in COVID screening clinic. This was this makeshift clinic that was set up in the ambulance parking lot adjacent to the emergency room. And, back then, I mean, this is in the spring of 2020, it was so awful. I mean, people being wheeled in short of breath and, getting intubated right away. And it was terrible, and still is, obviously, in many places. And I deleted it because, what do I need to do that for? I'm too old for that. And I just felt really uncomfortable about having deleted it, and I couldn't figure out why. I felt, having practiced medicine for 30 years, I had kind of done my part. But I just felt very uncomfortable. And so I ended up retrieving the email and volunteering. Now, I want to emphasize 2 things about this, which I do in the essay. First is that I am not a brave person. I am a complete chicken. And the second, I mean, I really am a chicken. And the second is that, I mean, what I did in that screening clinic is nothing compared to what my colleagues were doing in the emergency room, in the ICU, and and so forth. But that impulse to say, wait a minute, I've been a doctor all these years. I can't stop being a doctor right now. That felt to me kind of very elemental. And I was when that was published originally in the New England Journal of Medicine, I thought, oh, I'm going to get all this feedback from people who are like, who do you think you are? You worked in a clinic. That was nothing compared to what we did. But that wasn't the feedback I got. Even people who were truly on the front line said, yeah, that was the impulse. That's what kept us going. And I just I was really happy to be able to honor them through that essay and to reproduce it in the book, and now on the radio too, and on the NPR piece.
So, which leads to a question from Jill, who, she asks how you think about your legacy. And I would say, certainly not just about COVID at all, but about yourself as a doctor and a writer and a mother and a daughter,
Gosh,
spouse.
legacy. I think I need to get some face cream if I'm being asked. It's like when my patients say, "When are you retiring?" It's like, "Oh, I need to work on that." Yeah. The book's also kind of funny, just so you know.
Book is funny.
My legacy, I'll tell you something, Jill. What I value more and more than anything, is just kindness. And I think, when I hang up my stethoscope, if my patients, um, and my students and my trainees, and ultimately when I hang up my earthly stethoscope, my children and my grandchildren, remember that I was kind, and particularly that I I made an effort to see them as they truly are. Um, then I will feel very happy about that. Well, of course, I won't be here anymore, but I project that I would have felt very happy about.
I wanted to ask you, I know that well, you said you went part-time, and that now that your writing and your medical career are in a way one and the same, and it sounds like spend a good portion of your work time doing writing related activities, be it leading groups or reviewing manuscripts or leading or teaching. So one question related to that is, because you write and you're now a very public writer, you must get either people both, in the hospital, but then people from around Boston or even around the country who want you to be their doctor, because you are indeed funny and wise and smart.
But that's an easy one, because yeah, that's an easy one because I'm not taking new patients, and it would be unfair to do so. My horizon isn't long enough. I do primary care. I do longitudinal care. I take care of people for 20, 30 years. So, there's so many younger, absolutely wonderful doctors, including, many in my own hospital, that I don't have any trouble saying, you don't want me. You want somebody who's going to know you for the next 20 years.
Do you have a go-to, one or three that you like to say, oh, see Dr. So-and-so, and, she will take good care of you, or he, or whatever?
Well, unfortunately, the reality is that's pretty tough, right? Because there's a shortage of primary care doctors, and the system is pretty stressed. But yeah, we are fortunate to have a large group with a number of just absolutely wonderful younger doctors, and I feel I can say in absolute good conscience that they'll get excellent care from them. In some ways, I think actually better care than from me, and certainly better care than from me now, because I mean, when you get sort of really late in your career, the good news is you're really seasoned, you're really experienced, but you don't have the fire in the belly to keep up, to learn new things in quite the way that you do when you're younger. And patients deserve that, particularly younger patients?
So, I like whenever I talk to a doctor or interview a doctor, I like to ask, what you think is maybe the biggest problem in healthcare, but let's not go there because we're near the end of the hour. So instead, let's focus on whether it's COVID related or not. I just interviewed someone who wrote a book about care after COVID and how he's very optimistic as a physician that COVID is a sort of a turning point, and we've energized all of these new ideas that are going to really fix I don't know if you fix the healthcare system, it might be a stretch, but improve care. So what makes you optimistic? And it doesn't have to be about healthcare per se, but is it could be about writing or about, the soul of our young trainees, or, what fills you
Well,
with hope going
well, I
forward?
I can answer the question you didn't ask and the question you did ask as one,
Perfect. Great.
right? You get a twofer.
Wonderful.
Um, the problem I'm most concerned with is the lack of advancement of women into positions of power and influence. We are crowding the entry gates. There are more of us than men applying. There are more of us in residencies in many specialties, but we're not professors and we're not deans and we're not heads of committees. And I won't say that's the number one problem. There are, so many challenges, but I think medicine would be greatly enriched and patients would be greatly benefited by more women being in positions of power and influence. What makes me optimistic is the number of bright, dynamic, ambitious, empathic, creative women who are coming up the ranks. But we got to you know put some more cracks in that glass ceiling for it to really matter. Because if you're bright and creative and ambitious and interested in solving problems, and you're battered down by pay inequity and harassment and burnout, and you end up leaving before you're 40, um, uh, we're not going to make the kind of changes that we need to make.
That's a great answer. Well, I love this book. I couldn't put it down. I read it in basically one night, which I heard other people did too. It's lovely, and is written by a lovely person. Suzanne Koven, thank you so much for joining us here at Magic City Books tonight, and congratulations on your book, and best of luck on your book tour as it continues.
Thank you so much. And it has been a pleasure to Zoom to Tulsa this evening.
We got to get you here for real next time.
That'd be a lot of fun. Thanks,
Yeah.
John.
Thanks a lot. Have a good night, everybody.